Hey everybody, NecroVMX here, and a little overdue, but today we're going to continue the look at the Nintendo consoles, and today we're going to look at the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was announced actually not too long after the Game Boy Color was becoming prevalent, which is half the reason that I never had a Game Boy Color. This isn't even mine, this belongs to a friend. I borrowed it for the feature. I never had a Game Boy Color because I wanted to get one, but I couldn't afford one right away, and then when I could, I heard about the Game Boy Advance, and I heard it would let you play Game Boy Color and Game Boy games, so I said, why don't I just wait for that one? And that's what I wound up doing. Plus, a lot of the Game Boy Color games didn't interest me as much, but the Game Boy Advance games were interesting me a lot more. Now, while the Game Boy Color was sort of a disappointment in the way that although it added color, it was still 8-bit graphics. In other words, it may have been a little bit more powerful than an NES, but basically it was just a portable NES. Does that mean that the Game Boy Advance is a portable Super NES? No, actually it's 32-bit, which gives it a little bit more oomph than the Super NES. So even Super NES games that showed up on the Game Boy Advance were usually a little bit enhanced, and a lot of the original games looked better than what that system could offer. So let's take a look at the Game Boy Advance. This is the original model. It came in several different colors. I got the clear one because that seemed like the coolest cover to have. Notice the nice widescreen display. This actually seemed to make a whole lot of sense to me, but it led to some problems with the Game Boy Player on the GameCube. It basically had to squish it to fit normal-sized TVs. I kind of wonder what would happen if you took a widescreen TV, hooked up a GameCube with a Game Boy Player, and played a Game Boy Advance version. Would it come out in widescreen? I don't know. There's a letterbox format, but there you have it. And here's how the buttons are set up. Here you have your typical D-pad. Start and select are over here now, and they're really small buttons. I kind of wish they were a little bit bigger, but, well, there you have it. There's where it says Game Boy Advance, as if you didn't know what you were buying. And there's, of course, the B and A buttons as usual. Note the lack of more face buttons. There aren't an X and Y button. Nintendo originally planned to come out with a Game Boy that would have come out after the Game Boy Color and before this, and it had 4 face buttons and basically looked like the Game Boy Color. For whatever reason, it never happened. However, they did introduce the L and R shoulder buttons, so at least there were 4 input buttons for the Game Boy Advance. Taking a look at the top, you can see that's where the cartridge slot goes, and that right there, the EXT, is where your link cable would go. Taking a look at the bottom, we have the on and off switch right there. And over here we have the headphone jack, and this is the volume. There's another jack here, but I'll get to that in a second. The sides are actually really, really boring. There's nothing there. Just these padded areas. Here's the back of it, and there's the information. Notice it says AGB, as in Advanced Game Boy. Just like the Game Boy Color was internally referred to as Color Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance was internally referred to as the Advanced Game Boy. Here's where the batteries would go, and it only took 2 AA's. This is actually a third-party thing. It's a battery pack made by Mad Catz, and that's what that jack on the bottom is. That's where I would charge it up. So kind of like the DS's battery, except it's a third-party thing. The only thing is that once you take it out, it could be kind of a bitch to get back in. You kind of have to force it back in. There's not really much more to say about the Game Boy Advance. I'll show you the games. Here's a typical Game Boy Advance game. Notice that they're a little bit wider, but a lot shorter than the typical Game Boy games. Also notice that right there and right there, it's a little bit wider. That stops you from putting it in a normal Game Boy. Well, here's a Game Boy Color, and as you can see, although it seems like it's going to fit at first, well, actually it fits perfectly. It's kind of weird. But it wouldn't work. It wouldn't go in a normal Game Boy, and they wouldn't play these games anyway. This is Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, by the way. And you would just put it in like this. Oop. Hold on one sec, guys. It's hard to do this. Like such. Click it in, and there you go. And then it has this neat little handle where you can just pop it right back out. It also will accept... One second. Should have these ready, but well, I kind of do, but I kind of don't. So give me 1 second here. Game Boy Color games, and you can see that they stick out quite a bit more. Games that play in both Game Boy Color and Game Boy. Okay. and it fell down. Oh, here it is. Original Game Boy games. And it will play all of them. Kind of interesting, no? One thing is that it didn't have something like this. These are the protective cases given to Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. But for whatever reason, the Game Boy Advance games, they got no such courtesy. I don't know why they didn't do that. Maybe they didn't want to manufacture these things and they were keeping costs down or whatever. But notice again, look how much smaller it got. Here's a Game Boy Color game, which is the same size as a Game Boy game. Here's a Game Boy game. I mean, they're all the same size. That one's not on the case, so you can see better. You can see it's about half the size. So kind of interesting, no? The Game Boy Advance was a big hit. The only problem, no backlight. No front light either, so your lighting had to be perfect. It was kind of like the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, but by this time in Nintendo's history, it was kind of annoying. We wanted a backlight. Eventually, they re-released it as the Game Boy Advance SP, which I guess stands for Special. Unfortunately, I don't have one to show you, but the design was, well, a lot more like this, except it actually flipped up, which is kind of a precursor to the DS if you think about it. That one had a front light. However, it didn't have a headphone jack. They made a third version of the Game Boy Advance, which unfortunately I also don't have to show you, called the Game Boy Micro. The design was more like this, but it was smaller, although it had a huge screen. It had a headphone jack and a backlight. The only thing is, a person with big man-sized hands like me had a hard time gripping it. And honestly, I like the original design the best. I just wish there was a light. Well, that's what the Game Boy player is for anyway. Or you could play in the bathroom. The bathroom always gives you the best kind of lighting. Anyway, that's my look at the Game Boy Advance. It was a pretty big hit, and it didn't really die out until the DS came out. And even after the DS came out, there was a trickle of Game Boy Advance games for a few months. It was a really, really good system that never really got the respect it deserved, but there were some amazing games for it, including 3 games in my favorite series, Castlevania, including my favorite Castlevania game ever, and probably my favorite video game ever, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. I mean, there were some great Mario remakes, Donkey Kong Country, but there were also great originals like Metroid Fusion and, Advance Wars and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Well, that was sort of an enhanced remake, but there was a lot of great games, and if you were sort of an old-school gamer, you probably enjoy a lot of the Game Boy Advance games. Sometimes the graphics could throw you. You don't really expect them to be that good, and sometimes they look like crap. Well, that's the way it is. The Game Boy Advance was a damn fine handheld, and it was officially the end of the Game Boy era. After the Game Boy Micro, the next handheld was called the DS. There was no word Game Boy in there, so in a lot of ways, it's the very last of the Game Boy brand, which went all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s when the first Game Boy came out. Anyway, since this video was about a week late, I'm going to go right into next week, and we're going to show you the next in the series, which is going to be the DS. We're going to take a look at that, Nintendo's latest and most current handheld, so I'll see you then.